Okay, so you've shared some materials about HSPB8 myopathy,
Hmm.
also known as myofibrillar myopathy type 13, MFM for short, with rimmed vacuoles. And it sounds like maybe you or someone you care about might be going through this. So we're going to do a deep dive and really try to understand what all this means.
Yeah, that's right. What we're trying to do in this deep dive is to take what can be really complex medical information and make it much more clear and understandable, especially for individuals and families who don't have a background in biology or medicine, but are dealing with this diagnosis or maybe even suspecting it. So we're going to use the details that you provided and try to build that understanding together.
Perfect. So, even just the name itself sounds kind of intimidating. Myofibrillar myopathy type 13 with rim vacuoles.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin to unpack all of that?
Yeah, let's break it down piece by piece. Okay, so think about your muscles as kind of like ropes, right? Like many tiny ropes bundled together. And inside those strands are even smaller working parts. And those are called myofibrils. So these are really like the engine parts that allow your muscles to contract and that allows you to move. So that word myofibrillar tells us that the problem is within these essential components of the muscle. Myopathy is a more general term. It just refers to any disease that affects the muscles, and it usually causes things like weakness, cramping, or stiffness. And that's because the muscle fibers are damaged or they're not working the way they should.
I see. Okay, so the little engines aren't working right. That makes sense. So then what about HSPB8? That sounds very specific.
It is. HSPB8 refers to the specific gene that's involved in this particular type of myopathy. And genes, as you probably know, are like the instruction manuals for our bodies. When there's a change or a mutation in the HSPB8 gene, it kind of messes up those instructions for making the HSPB8 protein. And now this protein has a really, really important job. It acts like a tiny but very tireless janitor inside your muscle cells, and it's constantly looking for and managing any proteins that are damaged or haven't folded correctly, so kind of sweeping away protein trash that could otherwise clog up the system.
So a janitor for proteins. Okay, I like that. That's a great analogy. And then finally, rimmed vacuoles. What are those?
So these are kind of key clues that doctors will look for when they examine a small sample of muscle tissue under a microscope. And this usually comes from a muscle biopsy. So imagine you're looking at a slice of muscle fiber, and you see these little empty-looking spaces, vacuoles. What makes these rimmed vacuoles special is that they're surrounded by these rings or rims, and those are made up of proteins and other cellular debris. So they're like a visual sign that the muscle fibers are breaking down.
Gotcha. So basically, HSPB8 myopathy is a genetic condition. The muscle cells have a faulty protein janitor. This leads to mismanaged proteins building up. And then you get these empty spaces with protein rings, the rim vacuoles, inside the muscle fibers. And that ultimately causes the muscles to weaken and degenerate. Is that right?
That's a great summary. That's exactly right. But, it's really important for families going through this to understand that it might not be the same for everyone who's affected.
Right, of course. So for someone who is living with HSPB8 myopathy, what kinds of things might they experience in their day-to-day life? What kinds of symptoms might they start to notice?
Yeah. One of the most common and noticeable symptoms is this progressive muscle weakness. And that basically means the weakness tends to get worse over time. Often, it starts in the muscles that are closer to the center of the body, like the hips and shoulders. We call those proximal muscles. So, for example, you might start to notice it's harder to get up from a chair or to reach for something on a free shelf or maybe to climb stairs. And over time, that weakness can spread to other muscle groups.
Okay, and so besides just feeling weak, are there like physical changes in the muscles too?
Yes, absolutely. You might notice some muscle wasting. We also call it atrophy. This is where the muscle actually starts to look smaller, particularly in those muscle groups that are affected by the weakness. And it happens because the muscle fibers themselves are actually breaking down. So you might notice your thighs or your upper arms just appearing smaller over time.
Wow. I bet that makes getting around much harder.
Yeah, it can have a really big impact on someone's mobility. Because the lower body is often affected, it can get harder and harder to walk. And that could eventually mean needing to use a cane, a walker, or even a wheelchair to get around.
So it can get pretty serious then.
Mhm.
And what about other symptoms? Like, are there any other muscle-related things that can happen besides just the weakness and the wasting?
Yeah, so some people with HSPB8 myopathy also have muscle cramps and stiffness. And that can be uncomfortable, it can make it harder to move around, and it can just make everyday tasks more difficult to manage.
I can imagine. Sounds exhausting just thinking about all that.
Yeah, and fatigue is definitely a very common issue for folks with HSPB8. But this isn't just being tired after a long day. This is much more persistent and overwhelming. It's a real sense of exhaustion that can come from the weakness itself and the fact that the body is working so hard to compensate for those muscles that aren't working properly.
Yeah. And I guess this doesn't all happen overnight. Like, this must be a gradual kind of thing.
That's right. It usually is. The symptoms tend to develop slowly over many years. But it's so important to remember that everyone is different. The rate of progression can vary a lot from person to person. Just like we were talking about before, how the specific symptoms can vary and how quickly they get worse, it can be different for everyone. And that's why it's so important to get a proper diagnosis. And that usually involves a muscle biopsy, so doctors can actually see those rimmed vacuoles, plus genetic testing, and a really thorough examination.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about the symptoms. We know it's genetic. Can we dig a little deeper into what actually causes HSPB8 myopathy?
Absolutely. To put it simply, HSPB8 myopathy, which is also called MFM type 13, is caused by these changes in the HSPB8 gene. We call those changes mutations. So it's like a typo in the instruction manual for that protein janitor.
Right. And we talked about those typos being passed down in families. How does that inheritance actually work?
So HSPB8 myopathy is usually inherited in something called an autosomal dominant manner, which sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. We all get 2 copies of every gene, one from our mom and one from our dad. In autosomal dominant inheritance, only one of those copies needs to have a disease-causing mutation for a person to potentially get the disease. So if one parent has a mutation, that's often enough to cause the myopathy in their child.
Okay, so if a parent has this mutation, what are the chances of their child inheriting it?
So the chance of a child inheriting that mutation is 50%, or a 1 in 2 chance. And if they do inherit it, they could develop HSPB8 myopathy.
But then, even if people in a family have the same mutation, it can affect them differently, right? Why is that?
That's such a good question. It really shows how complex these genetic conditions are. Even if 2 people inherit the exact same HSPB8 mutation, how the condition actually shows up, which we call the phenotype, can vary a lot. Some people get really noticeable symptoms, while others might have such mild symptoms that they're easily missed, or sometimes they might not even have any symptoms at all. And this variability, it can be because of other genes that they have. Sometimes we call those genetic modifiers, and those can interact with the HSPB8 mutation. The environment can also play a role, like exposure to certain illnesses or toxins. Even lifestyle factors like what someone eats and how much they exercise can all factor into how the condition develops.
Wow, that's a lot for a family to try and understand.
It really is. And that's exactly why genetic counseling is so important for families who have a history of HSPB8 related conditions or who know they carry a mutation. A genetic counselor can give them really detailed information about what the risks are of passing the condition on to their kids. They can talk about options for family planning, and they can explain all the different types of genetic tests that are out there. Plus, they can really help families understand why there's so much variation in how the condition shows up in different people.
That's great. So we've talked a lot about this HSPB8 protein and it being the protein janitor. Can you tell us more about what this protein is actually called and what its normal job is in the body, especially in our muscles?
Yeah, so the full name is heat shock protein family B, small, member 8. And I know heat shock protein might sound a little strange, but it's actually really interesting. Heat shock proteins, or HSPs, are like the body's emergency response team. Our cells produce more of these proteins when they're under stress, like when it gets too hot, or they are dealing with other tough conditions. And their job is to protect the cells and help them cope with those difficult situations.
So, like, they're the cell's first responders. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
What about HSPB8 specifically? What does it do?
So HSPB8 is that quality control inspector. It's the janitor, and its main job is to find proteins that are either damaged or they haven't folded into the right shape. And proteins need to have a very precise structure to work right. And when they misfold, they can get sticky, they can start clumping together, which causes big problems in the cell. Kind of like if you had a misshapen part in a machine, it wouldn't work right. So HSPB8, it helps to either guide those misfolded proteins back into the right shape, or if they're just too damaged, it marks them for disposal, so it helps the cells stay healthy.
And why is this janitor job so important for muscle cells?
Because muscle cells are always working. They're always under stress, especially when we exercise or even just move around. And all that activity can lead to some damage to the proteins inside those cells. So muscle cells really need an efficient system to keep those damaged proteins in check and make sure they don't build up. And that's where HSPB8 comes in. Without it working properly, the muscle cells really struggle to stay healthy.
That makes a lot of sense. So for someone who thinks they might have HSPB8 myopathy or a family wanting to learn more, what's the first step in getting a genetic test?
The first step is always to talk to their doctor. Their primary care physician is a good place to start. They can talk about the symptoms, the family history, and if the doctor thinks it could be a genetic muscle disorder, they can refer the patient to a specialist. Usually that would be a neurologist who specializes in neuromuscular diseases, or a clinical geneticist or a genetic counselor. These specialists really understand these hereditary conditions, and they can help coordinate the right genetic testing. And, they can also offer support and guidance in explaining how genetics work, what the testing process is like, and what the results could mean.
So once you get to the specialist, what's involved in getting the genetic test itself?
Usually it's pretty straightforward. Most of the time you just need to give a saliva sample, and that gets sent to a special lab. Sometimes they'll use a blood sample. But saliva is becoming more and more common because it's easier. Once the lab gets the sample, they analyze the DNA and look for any mutations in the HSPB8 gene. The results usually take about a month to come back.
I've heard there are different types of genetic tests though, right? Like, what's the difference and how do you know which test to get?
Yeah, you're right. Some tests will just look at specific parts of the HSPB8 gene where mutations are really common. Those are like targeted tests. And then there are bigger tests that look at the entire gene sequence to find any and all variations. Sometimes doctors will even order what's called a genetic panel, which looks at multiple genes that are linked to different muscle disorders. So figuring out which test is right for a person or their family depends on their situation, their symptoms, and their family history. And that's why talking to a doctor or genetic counselor is so important. They can help figure out the best approach to get the most useful information.
Okay, I get it. That makes sense. So at a basic level, how does this DNA testing actually work? What are they actually looking for?
Okay, so the lab takes your DNA from your saliva or blood, and they compare it to a normal HSPB8 gene sequence. Basically, they're looking for any differences in your genetic code that might be a disease-causing mutation. These could be really small changes, like maybe just one letter is different in the DNA sequence. Or it could be a whole section of the gene that's missing or duplicated. That's how they can tell if you have a mutation that could be causing HSPB8 myopathy. It's like proofreading for typos in the instruction manual.
So we talked about who should get tested, but what are the main reasons why someone would actually want to get this HSPB8 testing?
There are two main reasons. One is to confirm a diagnosis in someone who's already having symptoms. Sometimes HSPB8 myopathy can look like other muscle diseases. So the genetic test can give a more definite answer and rule other things out. The second reason is for people who have a family history of HSPB8 myopathy but aren't having symptoms themselves. They might want to know if they have the gene mutation and if they might develop the disease in the future. And it's important to note that if a family knows there's a specific mutation running in their family, it's really best to test a family member who's already affected first. Once they know exactly what mutation they're looking for, it makes it easier and cheaper to test other family members, and the results are much more accurate.
So getting an accurate diagnosis is obviously huge. But are there other benefits to knowing if you have this condition through genetic testing?
Yeah, definitely. It can help doctors figure out if you need any other tests to check for other symptoms or health issues that might come along with it, so they can start treating those proactively. For example, if someone has breathing problems because of their muscle weakness, knowing the genetic diagnosis might mean they should use a BiPAP machine to help them breathe at night. And a confirmed diagnosis can also help with lifestyle changes. Like, what kind of diet and exercise is best for people with this specific condition? It also gives people the opportunity to participate in research studies, which is incredibly important because that's how we learn more about the condition, how it progresses, and ultimately how to develop better treatments in the future. And of course, like we talked about before, it can help families make decisions about family planning and whether other family members might want to get tested.
Wow, that's a lot of good information. But are there any risks or things to think about before getting genetic testing?
That's a really important question. For people who have symptoms and are trying to get a diagnosis, the benefits of understanding what's causing their problems usually outweigh the risks. But for people who aren't having symptoms yet and just want to know because of family history, it's really important to think it through carefully. Before doing the test, it's best to talk to a geneticist or genetic counselor. They can help you figure out why you want to be tested, if you really want to know the results, and how a positive or negative result could affect your life and your family. They're trained to help you make the right decision.
And there's a lot about protecting people's genetic information, right?
Exactly. That's the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA. It was passed in the U.S. back in 2008, and it protects people from discrimination based on their genetic information. So health insurance companies can't deny coverage or charge higher premiums just because someone might have a genetic predisposition to a certain disease. And employers can't use that information to make decisions about hiring, firing, or promotions.
That's good to know. So what does it actually mean if you get a positive result on the DNA test?
A positive result means they found a mutation in your HSPB8 gene that's known to cause the condition. So for someone who's been having symptoms, that usually confirms the diagnosis. It kind of backs up what the doctors were thinking based on the signs, symptoms, and the biopsy.
And what about a negative result? What does that mean?
A negative result means they didn't find a disease-causing mutation in the parts of the gene they tested. But what that means really depends on why the person was tested in the first place. If they were having symptoms, a negative result might mean their symptoms are caused by something else. But if they were tested because of family history and don't have symptoms, a negative result usually means they didn't inherit the family mutation and are unlikely to develop the condition. But it's always important to talk to your doctor or a genetic counselor about what the results mean for your specific situation.
This has been super helpful in understanding all this. To wrap things up, what's the most important thing for people facing HSPB8 myopathy to remember?
The main thing is that the HSPB8 protein is really, really important for keeping our cells healthy, especially when they're under stress. And this is especially true in our muscles because they're always active. HSPB8 is like the quality control system, making sure all the other proteins in the cell are doing their job correctly. HSPB8 myopathy happens when there's a problem with the HSPB8 gene and that protein isn't working properly. And luckily, we can diagnose this condition through genetic testing, which can give really important information to people with symptoms and families who might be at risk. So understanding the genetics is a really important first step in dealing with this condition.
You're absolutely right. Understanding the genetics is a huge step. And with all the research that's happening, what do you think the future holds for HSPB myopathy? Like, are there any new possibilities for treatment or management on the horizon?
That's a great question. And it's a hopeful one. Even though we don't have a cure yet, there's so much research going on that has a lot of promise. Scientists are working to understand the different mutations and how they actually cause the condition. And that could lead to more specific, targeted therapies. There's also a lot of research into gene therapy, which is about trying to fix or replace the faulty gene. And then there's research into new drugs that might improve protein folding or reduce the buildup of misfolded proteins. Plus, the more we learn about the pathways involved in this disease, the more potential targets we'll find for new therapies. And we can't forget about the patient advocacy groups. They're so important for raising awareness, connecting families, and even funding research. For anyone dealing with HSPB8 myopathy, staying up to date on research and getting involved with these groups can be so helpful. The field is constantly evolving, and there are so many people dedicated to finding new treatments for this condition.
It's great to know that there's so much work being done and that the patient community is so actively involved. Thank you so much for talking with us today. This has been incredibly informative, and I know it's going to help a lot of people.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.